Chapter 6. Decision. 12 years before the events of Team Gold. Ashpenez had developed a natural inclination for maps and charts. Navigating between the canyons and valleys served as a worthy talent to develop the given missions he volunteered for. His mostly human frame gave him enough cover to enlist in the Atlas militia that had all been assimilated into vacuo culture. It wouldn't be long before necessity would call them back to their own nation, but while they were here they certainly had become useful. Bandit activity had risen sharply over the last 2 years, and he was just old enough to serve in combat scenarios. His mother would always protest, but the rare visits from his father were what motivated him the most. The quiet but satisfied demeanor he always gave when he told him stories of all the new things he was learning was what he lived for. And even more so, he saw his father smile when he used the things he learned in practical ways. Serving as a chartman for the civil security squad that had brought them to their destination, he could feel his parents' pleasure as he fulfilled a purpose through the time and energy spent. The next great challenge was in the hands of the soldiers. They had discovered the largest bandit camp and realized quickly they were in over their heads concerning any immediate engagement or sabotage. Ashpenez waited with the vehicles as the soldiers moved to scout out their assets and form a more cohesive report to their nation about the threat to their military. Spinning a pencil between his hands, he staved off his boredom by looking over manuals and cleaning weapons his dad had designed for the team. Various sounds echoed through the canyon. Some were of an animalistic nature, others of humanity's vulgar roots. It was a single shriek that echoed through the valley beyond that his attention became fixed. Reaching to a radio, he whispered to the group to see if something had happened. Alpha 4, emergency, he repeated himself as radio protocol designated until he received a response. Negative. Another shriek rang through his ears in spite of the distance between himself and its origin. What is that? His emotions were urging him for a more direct explanation and caused him to treat the radio like a means of communication rather than coordination. He was reprimanded, but still offered an explanation. Radio discipline, Alpha Foe. POWs. He blinked at that. Stories of his childhood came back to him as another scream locked his attention towards the distant camp. He had never been through anything that would make someone scream like that and wanted to find a way to make it stop. Not just to bring peace to his mind, but an innate impulse of what ought to be done in the face of someone subjected to involuntary suffering. He didn't know why he had taken up the weapon he had been cleaning. He didn't know why he was abandoning their escape vehicles. But whatever was happening, his faunus muscles propelled him to swiftly and silently intervene. There would be consequences. He understood exactly what those actions could cost him and what would cost him. At best, he would no longer be welcome to join these groups after disobeying orders. At worst, they would lose their vehicles to scouting bandit troops and join the one he was moving to help. The consequences be accursed. I'm coming, was all he said. Ashpenez pushed himself farther and faster with a brass trident in hand, understanding that of the two options set before him, he would choose life so that he and another like him could live. Current day. Leia listened intently as she sat before her instructor once again. They had been meeting like this for months, and she hadn't missed a single session. The time had always seemed best spent to her when there was time for questions. The more he had been called to travel, the more keenly his absence was felt. Yet somehow he was just as diligent in taking the time for her as she was for him. I appreciate all you're doing for me, instructor. He gracefully took the compliment and continued. But does that answer your question? She learned a long time ago that giving him quick answers wasn't welcome in this environment. They may have reflected prudence in the classroom, but they were counseling. She needed to think things through. I'm still not sure. Instead of losing patience, the instructor merely gestured for her to explain where her thinking had gotten off track. Tell me then, how does this honor Gideon? She had gotten used to hearing his name. It had gotten to the point where she went out of her way to invoke his name. I don't think it's about that anymore. I think I was just trying to remember him. The instructor nodded. By forgetting everything else? Leia let out a shallow breath as she considered how those words would fit into her prior motives and behavior. I lost something when I saw his hand. In every single memory and experience we had together, that hand was always closed around his sword. It hurts when the last image of him calls everything I had once had into question. It's like I'm trying to maintain a statue without a picture to remind me where and when to correct errors. It wasn't appropriate for the instructor to smile, but his approval of her observation could be seen by the light in his eyes. With him gone, that relationship can't grow. And like you've seen with Daniel and Olivia, even the best of friends won't remain husband and wife without consistent and constant effort. He leaned forward to emphasize this point. On both their parts. Leia nodded. So you're saying that without him here, trying to have a relationship is pointless? His eyes narrowed as he considered her question. Not the kind of relationship you're pursuing. Your hope was to go to him without realizing it. Your desire was for him to return to you, but you tell me, which is reality? Leia acknowledged his point without an answer. He never expected one. Her next question, however, he did not expect either. You were the one who saved Daniel as a baby, right? The instructor blinked at the sudden change of topic and considered for a short moment where she was going with this. Yes, I was a part of that raid. He didn't give any further details without her inquiry. She took that as her cue. So who found Gideon? He suddenly realized her intention. You want to know where he came from? She nodded with her eyes remaining fixed on the floor. You also know what he was. She met his eyes at that with a hint of anger that he understood was justified. Getting up, he retrieved a backlog of reports from his bookcase contained within a volume identifying various strains of Grimm. After making his way to the back of the book, he adjusted the position of a piece of paper within the open range and placed it on his desk. Leia leaned forward as she looked over the description. Grimm Doppelganger. The instructor nodded. Based on the folklore of an identical copy that is your mirror image externally, but polar opposite internally. The caution of attracting the attention of one of these creatures is for them to infiltrate and replace people in positions of influence. The problem is that when these Grimm are made, radical changes in personality were too quickly noticed and their utilization became rare. He leaned forward to the bottom of the page. We have kept a close eye. The last documented report of one being formed was the image of a familiar face. Leia's eyes widened. Abimelech? The instructor affirmed her conclusion. We don't know how, but the Witch Salem's territory contains pools in which the Grimm spawned from. This is their genesis, or the end of their travels from another destination is unknown. All that can be said for certain is that cruel men looked into one of these pools and produced his equal and opposite in every way. Discarded for his gentle nature, we found him. Leia's eyes went from the page to the instructor. And you allowed a Grimm to share a room with children? The instructor shrugged. We took a risk in giving you weapons. We also took a risk with him. The hope was to discover a means by which the Grimm could be domesticated. Leia interrupted him and began yelling. Domesticated? My friend is not some kind of monster. Holding his hand up and allowing her a moment to voice her outrage, he continued. I didn't see a monster. I saw the opposite. I saw a man. And like Daniel, I put my life at risk before the head of Beacon to bring you all together. I don't regret my decision. I'm not asking you to either. Allowing the careful choosing of his words to take full effect, Leia's eyes returned to the floor and she slowly sat back down. "But you do regret something," she finally voiced. He didn't deny it. "As do you. The question is," she finished his sentence, "what happens next?" Her mind was still swimming full of information, but she knew that this was always how he intended for them to end their session. He nodded as she made her way out of his office and moved to the apartment she had recently moved into. The isolation wasn't healthy, but cathartic as she processed everything they had talked about that week. Daniel and Olivia rarely left her alone anyway, so the instructor never protested this living arrangement. As she made her way into her home, she let out a sigh of relief to discover she would actually be left alone today. She quickly made her way to a small drawer next to her bed and recovered a box from its contents. A small piece of peculiar rock that had become a memorial to one of their greatest victories and defeats for the same reason. Yet as she held the sharp rock within her palm, a new identity had been given to it. One thought passed through her mind over and over again, as her last attempt at bargaining revealed itself to her given this new piece of information she uncovered from the instructor about her friend. "I could see him again," she quietly spoke to herself. "I could see him." A knock at the door instinctively caused her to return the item to its place and pretend like nothing had happened. "Come in," she voiced, knowing who it was almost certain to be. Daniel's unmistakable bulk moved its way into the room, and Leia's ears began to twitch in search of where Olivia was going to appear. She never got tired of attempting to get the drop on her, even when it had become predictable after the 5th time. Nonetheless, she persisted in an attempt to entertain herself more than anyone else involved. Daniel's warm smile greeted her as she allowed herself to fall into their coordinated trap. It surprised her to simply see Olivia make her way into the room visibly behind him. Her ears relaxed as the threat of surprise from a prank came in a new form. "I wasn't expecting you." Daniel let out a hearty laugh. "You've been talking to the instructor every week since summer, and it's starting to get cold. Every single time we've brought you food and you haven't caught on yet." Leia gestured to Olivia. "I wasn't expecting you to come peacefully." It was Olivia's turn to laugh, but she sensed the atmosphere and chose to pass on the opportunity. Instead, she asked a question. "What was in that box you were holding?" Leia's ears immediately returned to a hostile state, and she had to take a moment to remind herself that there wasn't hostility behind the question. "You could see it through the door?" Olivia blinked and tilted her head. "I could see you, and you were excited about it. I didn't mean to..." Leia waved away the consolidation and decided that it would accomplish nothing trying to hide it. Retrieving the box and revealing its contents to them, Daniel and Olivia exchanged glances and waited for Leia to explain what it was. "It's from Abimelech." The mention of his name solicited a reaction from Daniel that showed visible tension on his face. Apparently, Olivia sensed it and drew her husband's arm to her in an attempt to comfort him. Leia continued. "When he heard us, Gideon pulled this out of his body when he finally noticed he was reflecting more of..." Regarding Daniel, who was anticipating the mention of his name again, she decided to put what she had been learning intentionally to her external conversations as well. "He wasn't himself, and the instructor pointed that out to him," raising a piece of rock and drawing their attention to a particular point. They all noticed a darkening in color in what was normally a plain gray surface. "I've had this since before he went to the witch's castle, and since then I found out there may be a reason for keeping this." Daniel shook off his unnerved state and made the conscious effort to speak first. This made Olivia smile despite the nature of their conversation. "Reason for what?" Leia put the stone back in its place and set it aside. "Do you remember our graduate course on ethics before they dropped it from our curriculum?" Olivia's eyes went down and her tone became quiet. "From every curriculum," Daniel nodded. Apparently, the nature of the gods made the concept of right and wrong unintelligible when it came to condemning the words of that monster and praising the deeds of the Creator. Leia was glad he remembered. The implications had been haunting her since they pieced them together, and she was glad to know she wasn't alone. We couldn't have been the first to notice this, but apparently we're the first to care enough to point it out. And the moment it was pointed out, they responded by eliminating the field of study from future generations entirely. Daniel shrugged. I can give people enough credit to ask good questions even when their teachers aren't telling them the answers. What does this have to do with Gideon? The voicing of the possibility brought a smile to Leia's face that for some reason unnerved the one she was talking to, only more so when they heard the words that inspired it. What if I told you there may be a way to bring him back? Her quotation of Olivia's captioned photos didn't earn her the response she wanted. They only just stared at her, adding an ever-increasing heaviness to the room. Leia finally broke the silence. If we can't say our choices are right or wrong in this world, does that mean that we still can't make them? Daniel and Olivia were both still trying to take this all in. She could tell the idea of restoring life was preferable to maintaining death when it was in their power to undo, but a key question remained unspoken. Where did you find this out? Daniel asked without breaking eye contact from Olivia. I asked the instructor a question about Gideon, and he gave me a book that had the answer. Daniel's eyebrows raised slightly as a sidelong glance broke the concern on his features as a testimony to his familiarity with their teacher. That sounds like him. But what exactly did that book say? Leia pursed her lips to compensate from her irritation. Well, it said It was her turn to be unnerved. The image of her friend turning to ashes before her eyes, with it came the trauma she experienced at that moment, and she began to feel faint. Daniel and Olivia both moved to steady her as she apologetically moved with them to her bed. I'm sorry, Olivia tenderly shushed her as Daniel finished her thought. I know what he was. I was there too. I just don't know about this. We're not only dealing with too little information, but there's too much of a risk going back to that place. Olivia drew Leia's eyes to her own. Especially if it could hurt him. That quieted her thoughts for a moment. Until this moment, she was only considering how the return of her friend would alleviate her own grief and loneliness. Images of the desperation she always sensed in his voice as he was robbed of sleep and peace on an account of his nature. The guilt she saw in him when his semblance forced him to act against his will. The gentleness she had almost allowed herself to love was constantly being consumed by the blade bound to his hand. Yet, even as these things all cleared the fog of selfishness from her mind, her downcast eyes caught the sight of metal on Olivia's finger, and the haze returned full force. She wanted something from Gideon that could never be. The envy in her heart that she was the one who had let go of her friend, and Olivia had the moment to see her relationship with Daniel form into something new. She had the glorious wedding ceremony before the altar, and the Creator, while the Destroyer dominated her life. She had the opportunity for complete vulnerability and intimacy with that friend. She stared at the ring on her finger and allowed these thoughts to cloud her mind until her eyes were as empty as the tainted steel that was too dusty to reflect any light. Had she voiced a single one of these things to them, like she had been encouraged to do by the instructor, she would have discovered that this experience Olivia had with Daniel was not what she was building it up to be in her mind. That as wonderful as her marriage was, it wasn't what her mind had made it to be. It wouldn't be an answer. But she refused to even ask the question. The rest of the time they spent together, she remained quiet, her eyes fixed on the box set aside as the answer to a problem she already had the solution to. Nebo's ship set down in the hangar of Shade Academy once again for the delivery of weapons for the next generation of students. Allowing himself a moment of nostalgia every time he had the honor of doing this, his eyes noticed a familiar face and stopped his aides in order to acknowledge it.
Miss Luminell, wonderful to see you, my dear.
Despite his age, he never reserved himself when it came to things he was interested in. The things he worked hard in building up always drew his attention, and with it the rigor of youth that had long departed from his body. She made no attempt to acknowledge him, but she realized he was moving her way. A hollow glance towards her intended destination brought with it no shortage of frustration when something stood between her and it. The tension in her muscles apparently was lost on the old man as he continued to make his way to her in order to speak with her again. "Dr. Nevo," she said through gritted teeth. "So nice to see you again." He let out a sigh of relief and continued to make his way to her as the aides carrying the weapons were forced to set them aside to assist him. He appreciated their concern, but drew their attention instead to the faunus before them and gestured to her belt.
"You see those? Those were the first generation of huntsman weapons sent to this academy, and in quite capable hands. I always loved your culture, Havalaya. The other academies have always taken it to giving their tools names as unique as their own. What did you call yours again?"
Brushing aside his failure to keep up with current events at the mention of her old name, she answered his question simply and waited for him to finish. "Faithful companions." He let out a hearty laugh as he mulled it over in his mind like a well-seasoned morsel taken during a meal.
"They certainly have been trustworthy companions, haven't they?"
He tapped his aides and pointed out the guitar strings spooling from her back harness.
"You see those wires? Weapons in their own right against the Grim. They're not only designed to support her own weight, but withstand the torque and heat generated from their rapid maneuvers in and out of danger. Just like watching you when you were only a child. You were quite the runner, you know. I never understood that. I always figured that you shouldn't run unless you have to. But that's probably my military days speaking for me. You were always running into danger. Almost had a heart attack watching you all the day. I brought you those weapons. May I see them?"
Letting out a brief sigh, she humored him by drawing her left blade and handing it to him edge out. A feigned look of surprise on his part drew her attention back to what she was doing at the moment. He raised his hands in mock surrender, and she apologetically tossed the knife up and put the handle out to him instead. He took the blade and began examining the materials and mechanisms to whoever was listening. While this was going on, she crossed her arms as she waited, given that the cable still attached to it rooted her to whenever she decided to end his lecture and give it back to her. As she alternated glances between the doctor and the end of the hangar, she felt like she had tripped on something and was helpless until someone came along to help her up again. One of the aides caught her field of vision, and for a moment they made eye contact. Shyly, he quickly diverted his eyes from her, and in doing so accidentally dropped what he had been holding. She beat him to his attempt to retrieve it and held it out for him without taking any time to consider what it was. "Thank you, ma'am," he said cordially, and took what she realized was a white visor from her hands. She maintained her grip on it for a moment longer than she should have and earned the attention of the aide trying to retrieve it. Her eyes met his again and discovered that he was a faunus. His feathery brown hair and pronounced eyebrows suggest the shape of a barn owl, with one other feature that most drew her attention. His pupils were so accustomed to a nighttime environment that they almost fully encapsulated his iris in black. Another moment passed before she uncomfortably let go of the visor and began apologizing to him profusely.
"Oh, I'm sorry. It's just
He waved away her concern. "I work with the guy. I know how he works. He never seems to run out of energy once he finds a purpose to start moving, or in this case, talking." She let out a courteous laugh at his attempt to lighten the mood, and the shadow of a smile began to make its way across her face as she began to examine his features. He was a fairly athletic build and undeniably handsome. His faunus features made themselves known here and there throughout his person and were mostly concealed by his uniform. The boxes he had been carrying contained all sorts of metals and other material that spoke for his impressive frame. She began to consider if they also carried over to his leg muscles concealed beyond her field of vision, and began to entertain the idea of him joining her on a run. Yet, just as the image formed in her mind, this golden glint of a wedding band made itself known as he adjusted his grip on the box. Her features quieted once again and realized that Nebo was trying to get her attention. "I'm sorry, sir?" He smiled as he held out the knife handle back to her as a reminder of their first exchange.
"Thank you for humoring me, Havalaya. I hope we see each other again very soon."
She took in his quiet and sincere smile and did her best to return it. A nod of regard was made to his aides, and she continued on her way. Strapping herself into the helicopter and entering her clearances as a huntress for official business, she set aside the box attached to her belt in the seat next to her, containing Abimelech's stone, or more specifically, containing Gideon's blood. Daniel woke with Olivia once again comfortably on top of him and examined the clock to see it was almost time for Leia's counseling session. The change in his breathing roused her, and she moved to kiss him on the cheek. He returned the gesture on her lips, and they both moved to start their day. With breakfast prepared and casual clothing acquired, Daniel went to the closet that contained his armor and weapons and breathed a sigh of relief that it was going to be a day where he could hopefully let them gather dust. He reached for a small collection of linen and checked to make sure he had everything he needed for what they intended to accomplish that day. Olivia did the same and decided to surprise him when she realized she had gotten dressed first. She jumped on his back and wrapped herself around his broad shoulders and worried that she had gone too far when he stumbled from the impact. The moment passed and he began laughing to assure that his aches had gotten better. "Are you sure you don't want medicine?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Olivia shrugged her shoulders while maintaining her grip. "For whatever's ahead." He reached back to hold one of her hands and gently let her down. The look of assurance said that he wasn't going anywhere, and the light of hope was returned. "So what should we get for Leia today?" Daniel gestured to the direction her home was located. "Why don't we visit her first? She's been doing better about eating, and I'd like to let her decide what she wants." Olivia nodded and began to take in their surroundings as they began their routine journey. Passing the student dorms, the gun range, the exercise field, and so many others that inspired memories of their childhood, she smiled and looked at Daniel, whose eyes remained forward and examining where he stepped. His eyes focused forward, drawing her attention to the source as a group of students began passing by. The familiar appearance of their uniforms put Olivia at ease, but the concern of her husband made her want to examine the matter closer. Their thermals weren't anything out of the ordinary. They weren't necessarily looking in their direction either. She figured he was assuming the worst until he had reason to otherwise, and couldn't necessarily blame him. Local crime had become something they were called in to deal with more often than grim incursions and bandit raids. When they finally rounded the corner, his arm went at rest and reached to draw it closer to her heart. "Thank you." Daniel turned to look at her curiously. She leaned her head on his shoulder and continued moving. "I'm just glad you're here." Daniel smiled and returned to walking with purpose until they reached Leia's apartment. The first and second knock on the door went unanswered, and Olivia began to become concerned. "Leia, are you home yet?" "Leia, are you home yet?" He moved to check his scroll and noted she should have been back 12 minutes ago. He moved to check his scroll and noted she should have gotten back 15 minutes ago. "Leia, Leia," Daniel and Olivia began calling out together until a neighbor heard their concerns. "Is something wrong?" Daniel rested his hand on Olivia and gestured to the school as he made his way to address the man. "Yes, I apologize for the noise. Did you see the woman who lives here leave this morning?" He nodded. "Yes, I'm the landlord. She was called for a huntsman assignment and checked in to update emergency contacts in case—" He looked Daniel up and down and could tell he was likely a huntsman too. "Well, you know." The look of dread on Daniel's face began to unnerve the man. "Is something wrong?" Daniel quietly nodded and began reaching for his scroll.
Is there anything I can do?
He stopped and turned around. If anything happens, please inform the school that Team Gold is Code 2. The man didn't understand the coding system, but he did understand the role of a messenger. He took out a notepad and quickly wrote down the information.
How long?
Daniel considered the question a moment before answering. 2 days. They nodded to each other, and Daniel began running back to their homes in order to retrieve their armor and weapons. Olivia showed her identification to the school gate and began using her thermals to keep track of where most people were gathered. After eliminating classrooms and the cafeteria as potential suspects, she narrowed down her search to the exercise field and hangar. The hangar being the more likely of the two options, she consciously utilized her semblance to avoid being stopped or disruptive. When she had examined the hangar from a distance, her higher education kicked in and moved instinctively to check flight logs with the supervisor. But before she could find the visible stripes that would set them apart from the engineers, she noticed a very familiar face.
"Nebo!"
she shouted in spite of her current circumstances. He reacted quickly to the call and was familiar enough with it to know the appropriate response.
"I think your semblance is still on, Olivia."
She stopped to ease her mind and simply materialized between the two workers who all but panicked at her sudden appearance. Stifling a giggle, she ran to meet the old man and give him a gentle hug. Given that she was usually the one to initiate these exchanges, he looked into her eyes and realized that something was wrong.
"Is there something I can help you with, dear?"
She nodded her head as if she was talking to her grandpa, asking for comfort from a casual injury.
"We're really worried about Leia. We couldn't find her this morning, and I need to know where she went."
His eyes narrowed in acknowledgement, and his thermal suggested regret as well. Without a word, he nodded to the supervisor, and she nodded in return. Taking one last moment to hug him again, she let go and ran over to the one he singled out. Watching her anxious body language quickly transition to shock and panic, one of Nebo's aides asked if something was wrong. He watched a moment longer to see a large man carrying his old rifle, among other things, into the hangar and approaching Olivia. With a somber smile, he shook his head.
"They can handle this. When we reach the classroom, remind Ashpenez that Team Gold has been deployed."
Leia landed her ship the moment Salem's castle came into view. After checking her equipment and noting the presence of Grimm that had clearly picked up on the scent of her emotions, she moved quickly from the interior with her knives at the ready. She counted a total of 4 Beowulfs without an alpha in her immediate area of concern and primed her knives for use. As her harness and arm braces moved to keep them attached to her wrist, she charged headlong into the first enemy coming her way and paid the price for the decision. It anticipated her movement and swiped her from the left side and dislocated her shoulder. The group continued to move her direction without coordination beyond instinct, and she realized she was in trouble. Whether she was unable or unwilling to fight back effectively, the only thing that kept her moving was muscle memory from training. She threw her right knife and embedded it in the closest beast, earning a roar of protest as it protruded between its neck and shoulder. The cable unspooled with the journey, and she waited until its length had been passed by the monster's feet. With a switch, the razor-sharp wire retracted the blade, cutting through the legs of the Beowulf in the process. Its body still held briefly within the knife and dragged the dissipating corpse closer to her, almost resulting in a collision. Moving to reset her shoulder and letting her semblance do the rest, she anticipated the arrival of the next beast and began putting distance between herself and the hostile entities. She continued to attempt moving her hands until the ache had passed into the realm of full motion before she planned on attempting any offensive maneuvers again. Her attention became focused on avoiding being cornered and attracting more attention than she could handle. With one final pop, she regained full motion again and moved to re-engage the Grimm. 3 more had joined the horde since she had last counted and decided to learn from her first mistake. They didn't have an alpha, so she began maintaining her advantage of reach. With a second and third attempt to throw her knife and succeeding to executing the monsters as they were baited by her presence alone, she eventually narrowed her threats down to 1. The only problem was that she didn't know where it was. She kept moving and listening until the Beowulf finally revealed itself as it struggled to climb a canyon it had fallen into. She slowed her pace and began to examine where she could properly put the beast down. It had climbed high enough that it was forced to keep its claws on the rock side lest it fall again into the crevice. This gave her the chance to swiftly and efficiently shove the knife into its left eye and force it to let go of the edge it clung to. It had dissipated before it hit the ground and had gone beyond the realm of a threat. Yet the image of the ashes still held her attention as she reminded of why she was here. A moment passed before she moved on and began searching among the dark landscape for any signs of the black pools the instructor's report had mentioned. Daniel and Olivia were both set down by a pilot and quickly urged on their way. No Nevermores had regarded their presence, but they weren't going to take chances with smaller threats. They loaded the last of their dust canisters into their weapons and began to move in a pattern they had coordinated for this exact scenario. Olive Branch involved Olivia taking a crow's nest position and suppressing any targets with warning shots. Then Daniel would either rush or burn them out depending on what the situation demanded. Once Daniel had cleared Olivia's minimum range where she could reliably cover him from threats, he would stop and she would move forward under the concealment of her semblance. This defined their progress for 2 miles until Olivia sighted Leia. They coordinated through hums on their scrolls until an outright call was warranted to communicate anything apart from stop and continue.
"She's 400 yards northwest and moving fast."
A Grimm's roar was cut short by a loud crack on the speaker feature before Daniel had a chance to respond. "I'd expect no less. I can't see the sun, so I'm going to keep moving closer to the castle. If I'm too far off, you let me know." Olivia pressed a button that sent one tone to him, informing him to continue. "I love you," he replied, before ending the audio feature. A small blush washed over her as she disappeared once again and moved closer to where her friend was. What would happen when she got there was anyone's guess. Daniel was always better at talking to people anyway. She figured that it couldn't hurt to have something to say as well. The only problem was that she could only do one thing at a time, and this moment demanded of her that she prevented her teammate and husband being overwhelmed by lurkers and Beowulfs. As another alpha came into view, she stopped and moved to immediately put it down. The first shot was enough, but she put a second through its sternum to emphasize the point to those nearby. It wasn't required for her to do her job, but she was satisfied the decision helped to accomplish it. As yet another alpha fell to Olivia's overwatch, he took a moment to wave to her before taking up his hammer for another swing. Moving between canyons didn't give him a lot to work with concerning direction, but he was aware that she would be the one to make sure he was going the right direction. She was life to him at the moment, and would pursue it as directly as the preservation of his own life through the confrontation of lesser Grimm continuing to surround him. He wasn't overwhelmed yet, and was grateful to a point that everything he had come across was smaller than him. The problem was that it was always more than one. Every decision to deal with one problem cost him something. A silenced Grimm allowed another to speak its voice. One threat eliminated allowed another to injure him. His aura was doing its job, but the price was still being paid. It was also taking its toll. They didn't entirely know what Leia was trying to do, but whatever it was would involve dealing with the Grimm. She was alone and didn't have to be. That bothered him. That was worth the price even of his own blood. Leia had become like a sister to him, and he wasn't going to let her be bullied without an answer for it. As he swung at a leaping Beowulf, he realized he had struck too low, and the momentum of its lunge was still going to carry. Rather than be blindsided, he allowed his knees to buckle and fell with the blow. His armor did its job, and the shattered ribs of the beast had already caused it to dissipate. 3 shots echoed through the canyon to allow him a moment to return to his feet. Each had met their mark and had even given him a moment to catch his breath. Instead, he chose to allow himself a moment more of being tired if it made his wife smile. He jumped up and down, waving in thanks for the cover fire. His scroll signaled a call rather than a buzz, suggesting there was some specific information he needed to know, rather than just moving forward or stopping. He pressed the button and answered the call in spite of his heavy breathing.
"I love you too,"
it said, and the message ended, preceding 2 buzzes. With a wide grin, he shook off the dirt and continued to move forward. Leia had a goal in mind, but had no idea how to reach it. All of the resources at her disposal to reach that goal fell short when she realized she was working with incomplete information. There were no photographs of the pools, nor a clear picture on what to do if she found it. Yet the more Grimm she encountered, the more she figured she was getting closer. As odd as it seemed that an increasing threat to her life suggests she was going the right direction, she was playing on the Destroyer's terms now. The irony of it all was that it was on the terms of death that she was looking for life. But she was desperate. She had chosen to put her hope in something, and the logic that stood in the way of it wasn't going to impede her at this point. What gave her pause was the familiar thunderclap in the skies had another voice added to its choir. Trap. She identified the weapon as its discharge was noted at least half a kilometer from where she was. It would be a lie if she found their presence a welcome discovery, yet it would also be untrue if she claimed she wanted them to leave. Her motives had inspired contradiction after contradiction in a world set at its foundations in conflict with itself. She was acting on emotion, she was following a promise that she had no reason to trust beyond her desire for it to be true. The philosophy of the mountain men had become her life. Cruelty for cruelty's sake would hopefully not stem from this. All she wanted was to see Gideon again. It was just as this desire was spoken that its fulfillment revealed itself to her. A small pit, indistinguishable from the shadows that enveloped it, revealed its substance as the birth cry of a Grimm echoed through the canyon before her, as its body soon followed. Its substance entered the land of the living, complete and fully aware of the purpose it sought to serve. Leia quickly moved to put the beast down and waited to see what would happen next. She took several steps back and waited to see if it was spontaneous or caused by a peculiar event, so her next move could be an informed one. Several moments of silence passed before another beast emerged from the pit without coaxing or cause apart from a small disturbance that took place on the pitch-black waters. The lurker was executed without ceremony, and she continued to silently look on. It was then that she discovered what she wanted to see. Taking a single stone in her hand, she tossed it into the waters, and the disturbance caused yet another monster to spring forth from its depths. Life from non-living things, she mused to herself as she retrieved the small black box from her pocket. Removing the stone taken from Abimelech's claw, she considered the possibilities as her friend's blood still remained on its edge. Leia approached the pool and attempted to scratch a single flake off of the stone, but quickly became dismayed at the attempt when it turned to ashes as soon as it left the rock's surface. Understanding what needed to be done if her hypothesis was to be tested, she prepared herself to part with the memento and release it into the pool. Please, let this work, she spoke to an audience she wished she had never pursued the attention of. With a final trembling in her wrist at the act she was about to commit, she released the stone and allowed it to submerge itself quietly into the tar-like substance before her. A long moment of silence passed before Leia's knees began to tremble. She had lost her last memory of her dearest friend, and it had all been for nothing. This thought had just taken root in her mind before the familiar resonance of metal being shaken by movement circled the corner around her. Not wanting to take her eyes from the pit, risking another Grimm emerging as well as disregarding her own grief, she acknowledged Daniel's presence by allowing her ears to rise slightly in acknowledgement. He didn't speak. He merely stood a short distance from her as he processed what likely had been done. Olivia soon appeared above them and allowed herself to fall down into the canyon where her friends both stood. She slowly approached her friend and wrapped her arms around her shoulders. The gesture wasn't resisted, nor was it received. Leia was utterly alone in the blackness of the pit she had lost Gideon's last tangible memory to, on a hope that the foundation of evil would somehow be benevolent to her. These pools, Leia finally said. This is where the instructor found him. Daniel slowly began to approach her as he concluded that there weren't any signs of Grimm nearby. I know, he said soberly. He found us both around the same time. Leia's empty eyes continued to watch the waters as they remained undisturbed for so long that the absence of any threat emerging from it seemed to put further weight on the atmosphere than if there were an enemy actually emerging from it. Leia continued, "His log told me that he was born when Abimelech mixed his blood with one of these pools. I hoped that—"
Olivia cut her off.
"We miss him too." The words reached it to the core of Leia's heart and pulled out the words that all of her envy and pain had clouded until this moment. She finally recognized that she wasn't suffering alone. Yet in the midst of that comfort came the pain that accompanied the thoughtless removal of a dry bandage. She had no tears to weep, no sobs to voice. All that emerged from her was a single sigh that finally released from her what had been causing the heartache she had carried with her over the last several months. Hope had been a double-edged sword that cut her as keenly as it opened a path to her. With this dead end finally recognized, she raised herself up from the dirt and turned to meet Daniel's eyes. With a small but noticeable smirk, she tried to communicate to him that she was ready to go home. Daniel didn't return the gesture. He seemed distracted by something taking place behind her. Olivia's head turned and processed the sight before she could, and noticed on her journey to take in that same sight that she was brandishing her rifle. She took in this information and moved to take up the knife to her right side, and drew a stance that only a lifetime of training could ingrain into her. If somehow to make up for lost time, a larger Grimm than should have been able to travel through the small pool was making its way to present itself before them. Its features were not unlike that of an alpha Beowulf, but carried itself with the gait of an Ursa. The malice that emanated from it had become as familiar as the scent of a meal enjoyed religiously every morning. Daniel made to put himself between it and the girls as they also began to take positions. Olivia moved to chamber a shard of dust and allowed the hammer to propel a stream of concentrated energy from the eye of the barrel to its directed destination. Leia was still shaken but trained enough by their drills that she moved a circle and engaged the monster as soon as it chose its target. Her wrist began to tighten around the handles of her blades, and the razor wires that bound them to her person were pulled taut in preparation for rapid and regular use. The Grimm prepared itself for its first and final roar, only to be overshadowed and outspoken by a scream that reverberated through the air with such force and depth of pain that caused even the soulless abomination before them pause to wonder at the sound of such despair. A human hand erupted from the stomach of the Beowulf and caused the excess ash already forming from the creature's end to scatter before them all. The impact and force behind the blow had so devastated the hand that it could only be recognized as human from the presence of blood and bone that covered the appendage. Yet no sooner had its brokenness revealed itself and the creature dissipated that the exposed body of an adult male could be seen from behind the Grimm, as the last of its essence disintegrated from the trauma that had been inflicted upon it. As the beast dematerialized before them all, the hand that had ended its short existence began to cover itself with jagged and directionless stone that only sought purpose in reflecting the shape of what it now attempted to cover. Weighed down by what could only be described now as a claw of broken marble, the man looked each one of them in turn with eyes as black as the pool he emerged from. With Daniel, he saw confusion and sought confirmation of what was before him. With Olivia, he began to back away at the sight of their weapons. It was when his eyes came to Leia that he stopped moving or reacting. His attention became entirely fixed on her as her own soul was mirrored before them in shock.
"Gideon?"
Leia said in a voice that bordered on a whisper. Her eyes instinctively moved to recognize the claw that had replaced his right hand, and a moment of doubt passed her mind. As soon as it took form within her, she realized what was about to happen. The next sight that took place before them all was Gideon reborn rushing her with the same fury and rage they'd expect from her, at the merest reminder of the one who had caused their friend so much pain.